Hello, this time on Sitrep, Donald Trump agrees to send new weapons to Ukraine as he loses patience with Vladimir Putin.
And I always hang up and say, well, that was a nice phone call. And then missiles are launched into Kiev or some other city. The talk doesn't mean anything.
This whole deal is also about missiles, about ammunition, so it's broader than Patriots.
We have one country that has 17 Patriots getting ready to be shipped.
Those Patriot air defense systems will certainly be welcome in Ukraine, with Russian missile and drone attacks at new record levels. Mike and I are joined by a former military attaché to both Kyiv and Moscow to take stock of the current state of the war and explain what difference, if any, the shifts from the White House could make. We also get some deep insights into the British veterans who've been fighting with Ukraine's Foreign Legion. Colin Freeman tells us about his book, The Mad and the Brave. And we've already seen how single small drones have radically reshaped the battlefield in Ukraine, but soon there could be swarms of them attacking at the same time. We explain all in our new series on transformative military technologies.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Well, it's no surprise to see Donald Trump changing his tune. He could, of course, change it just as easily again. Mike, you've been saying for months that President Trump switched sides in Ukraine war when he started talking to Vladimir Putin. Has he just switched back?
No, not really. Although what has happened is potentially quite important. I mean, it's more important than we thought it might be 2 or 3 weeks ago, but less important than it seemed last week when President Trump talked up this very important announcement he was going to make, and it was all a bit less in the event this week than some of us hoped it might be. But that's not to downplay the importance of being prepared to sell weapons, American systems, to NATO who could transfer them to Ukraine. That's important in that it gives the Ukrainians hope, if they're prepared to keep on fighting, that they can keep on fighting for some time, to what end we can argue about, but they're not going to be overwhelmed this year. But on the other hand, President Trump hasn't changed his tune in the sense that he doesn't want to lead the Western world. He doesn't want to lead the democracies in standing up to Russian aggression. He wants to get the Ukraine war out of the way as far as he's concerned, and he still hopes for a strategic partnership with Putin and Xi Jinping in which they will actually create a triumvirate of powers that will dominate the structure of world politics, that will really make the weather for everybody else. I don't think that has changed, but tactically he obviously wants to bring a bit more pressure onto Putin, at least over this issue, so that he can get the Ukraine war off his desk, even though it'll stay on Putin's desk for a very long time.
Well, let's just run through the headline details of what President Trump announced while he was sitting with the NATO Secretary General in the White House. He's authorized other NATO nations to donate their Patriot air defense batteries and missiles to Ukraine and buy replacements from the US. He said billions of dollars worth of other top-of-the-line weapons would be quickly distributed to the battlefield, again paid for by other NATO allies, and no detail on what those weapons are. This is the first time President Trump has approved new weapons supplies to Ukraine since he took office. And he's also threatened to hit Russia's economy by imposing a new 100% tariff on its trading partners if Moscow doesn't agree to a ceasefire within 50 days. What we want to do today is translate the political narrative into potential military effects, be they big or small, and assess what lies ahead. And to help us, John Foreman is with us once again, former UK defence attaché to Moscow and Kyiv. Good to see you again, John. Welcome to Sitrep. And before we dive into the detail, can you just give us your big picture assessment? Is all this potentially game-changing, a small shuffle, or somewhere in between all of that?
Well, thank you, Kate, and good to be back. I mean, I'm slightly more positive than Michael was in his introduction, and I think that Trump's spent the last few months getting progressively more irritated with Putin and finally made a change of his position after 6 months of trying to seek a win-win situation with Putin. Now he seems to be more prepared to send weapons at a price to Ukraine, and also to threaten, give an ultimatum to Putin to bring the hammer down on Putin's secondary trading partners should they not come back to the table. And of course, as you said, the proof will be in the pudding on delivery, whether it actually got to follow through. Trump can change his mind at the drop of a hat. He's changed his mind on Monday. He could change it back on tomorrow. So let's have to wait and see. But I think, that sense of disappointment was very clear on Monday in his tone of his remarks. On whether it's a game changer, I think we've been here before with lots of weapons have been promised to be game changers and they weren't. I remember tanks and F-16s and ATACMS and HIMARS. I think the real problem for Ukraine is that Russia's superiority of men and materiel and arms is basically dominating. Russia has the initiative on the battlefield and it's also pummeling Ukrainian cities. And I think, weapon supplies are always welcome. It's $10 billion. We don't know the details. We don't know when. We don't know where. We don't know who's providing. I mean, it will certainly help Ukraine, but whether it will tip the balance, I don't know.
And John, I said at the beginning that drone and missile attacks have reached new record levels. How much difference do you think that those promised Patriot systems can make, though?
Well, I think Patriots are really against the ballistic missiles Russia has, also those provided by North Korea. Russia is actually using less and less cruise missiles because it's felt that they haven't got the same effectiveness against Ukrainian air defences they wanted, because the ballistic missiles are harder to defend against. So obviously Patriot rolled out across Ukraine will help defeat those ballistic missiles. On the drones, I think we're at record highs now, 750 a time. I think there'll be over 1,000 by the autumn, and those drones are getting more complex and more sophisticated and more effective. So I think collectively, what Ukraine also needs is not just Patriots, it needs counter-drone drones, which they've developed. They need the money for that.
And Mike, it's been a while since you and I talked through the battlefield picture, but from where I'm reading, it looks like Russia has the momentum on the ground and it's picked up pace a bit.
Only a bit, yes. I mean, there was a big push in Sumy in the north, crossing the Kursk border, pushing the Ukrainians out of Kursk completely, and then trying to threaten Sumy itself, or create either that or create a sort of a defensive buffer along the border. And there's not been a great deal of progress in that. They've taken Yunikivka in the last week, just north of Sumy. But the Russians have put in their best forces, some of their VDV, their airborne forces, into that. And the Ukrainians have had to use some of their best reserve forces, including GUR troops, to hold them back. So in a way, both sides have put their best versus their best into that particular part of the battlefield. But the Russians are still far enough away from Sumy that they can't get into artillery range of it. If they do, then rather like they've done with other cities, they would bombard it, I'm sure, but they can't get there yet. So they're not making very much progress there. There's some pushes in Kharkiv, but again, places that have been fought over for a long time. They've taken back Kupiansk and they're pushing towards Borova and Lyman, but not making huge progress. The places where they look as if they might be making progress, and this is new, is down in the south in Dnipropetrovsk, because they look as if they're trying to move to cross the Selena River. They've got a little way to go yet, but some of the towns or settlements there, Ivkanivka, Novopavlivka, look as if they're under threat. And undoubtedly, the Russians are trying to open up a new front in Dnipropetrovsk. And they've never really threatened it much before, but they now look as if they do intend to do that. So they're moving out of the four oblasts that they claim to have annexed, which they still haven't completely conquered. They look as if they're trying to move back into Kharkiv Oblast and to move into Dnipropetrovsk. And that would give them 6 oblasts that they would claim. Because remember, President Putin said at the Petersburg Economic Forum, everywhere the Russian soldier treads is Russian territory. So he believes that as long as they've launched an offensive into those areas, they will have a claim at some point to annex them. So yes, they are moving forward, but it's still extremely slow. And as far as we know, they're still losing well over 1,000 troops every day to Ukrainian defences.
So, Mike, the billions of dollars worth of top-of-the-line weapons, what would be most useful to Ukraine right now, do you think?
Well, they need air defence, and they need as we keep talking about Patriots, but they need everything in the layered air defence. So they need to be able to layer it all the way down, as it were, from ballistic missiles down to the small and cheap drones. And then the other category of weapons they most need now are deep fires, as they're known, which is missiles and systems that can get behind the lines and make it difficult for Russian forces on the front lines to receive their ammunition and to receive their replacement troops and so on. So those are the two things: air defence and deep fires. But of course, they need more of everything because, as John said, I mean, they're short on people. They're up against a much bigger power that can keep on pulling, driving people and material onto the battlefront. But if you had to say what are the priorities, air defence and deep fires are the two categories of weapons that they need most, I would say.
John, the tariffs President Trump is threatening, they're not a military tool, but it's a chain that leads from Russia's oil fields through its economy into the defence industry and onto the battlefields of Ukraine. How much battlefield impact do you think sanctions could really have?
Well, it's going to be a slow impact, isn't it? I mean, I think it was General Zaluzhny said a year ago that they wanted to take the battle back to Russia itself. And I don't think the war's going to be settled on the battlefield. I mean, I don't entirely agree with Michael's characterisation. I think in the Donbass, there's two large pockets are formed. The front is 1,000 kilometres long. 20% of that front is under attack by the Russians. The Russians are actually advancing, according to Ukrainian experts, at the same pace as they did last year. So they retain the initiative. They're on the front foot. But I think targeting Russia's war machine means targeting Russia's economy, whacking 100%, 200%, 500%, whatever, to Trump decides tariffs on Russia's partners, especially on oil and especially on minerals, which is where Russia's getting its export earnings from, is important. But again, I think that'll take time to play through. I mean, the ultimatum was 50 days. We're 48 days from that now. But of course, in any economic warfare will take weeks and months to come through. That's, of course, if Russia's partners actually decide to actually change their trading patterns or whether they just suck it up.
Well, The Economist has an interesting assessment which calculates that at the current Russian rate of advance, it would still take them 89 years to take the whole of Ukraine. Perhaps more to the point, they wouldn't take the 4 eastern regions that President Putin already claims are annexed by Russia: Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, until 2029. Of course, that ignores the possibility of a breakthrough. Mike, we don't know if President Putin reads The Economist. He probably doesn't, but he knows the facts, and he knows that Ukraine feels in a better position today than it did a week ago.
Yes, but he has a theory of victory that a lot of people are talking about now, that he articulated to people around him certainly over a year ago now, and it's a theory of victory based on attrition, so that in the long run he believes Russia will win out, and that will happen in one of two ways. Either Ukraine will give up. It will see that it must ultimately lose in the long run, and therefore will give up and go for some sort of negotiation on bad terms. Or the attrition will suddenly pay off with a breakthrough somewhere, that eventually the Ukrainian forces will find that they're broken in several places at once, and then there'll be a quick strategic push. Now, I think that second possibility is less likely than the first, but both of them are routes to victory, as Putin seems to see it, through the process of attrition.
And John, you surely have more chance of understanding the mind of President Putin than any of us. Is the shift in the political ground, I see you smiling at that, the shift in the political ground going to cause a shift in his military calculus?
No, I don't think so. I think Michael's right. I think Putin thinks he's got the upper hand. He thinks Ukrainians are losing. He thinks the American support is wobbly. He thinks the Europeans are weak. And, he's 3.5 years in. He's basically placed his presidency on this bet to defeat Ukraine, probably by capturing the eastern oblasts, probably not by advancing on Kiev, and to grind out a political solution on his terms. Denazification, as he calls it, i.e. regime change, demilitarization, i.e. reducing the size of the Ukrainian army, no NATO membership, and also giving Russia a permanent say in Ukraine's foreign domestic policy. And I think he may think that he's on that path, notwithstanding Trump's recent decision. And of course, as I said, it's all about delivery. What will be delivered to Ukraine when? What would be the effect of these tariffs if they ever come about? Does Trump really want to blow up the world oil trade or trade more generally by giving 100% more tariffs on China or 100% tariffs on India or whoever else trades with Russia? So I think he does think he's got the position. I think Michael's right about Putin's theory of victory, and he shows no sign of backing away from that.
So Moscow has the momentum on the ground, but it's pretty minimal. It's a slow-grinding summer offensive, and Ukraine have just been handed the hope of some new firepower. Where does it go in your view, Mike, from here?
Well, they'll want to make good where they can on the biggest problems that they've got, particularly on the front lines and with their ammunition stocks and their missile stocks. But then, depending on what arrives and who pays for it and how quickly all that process happens, and those are big ifs at the moment. But let's assume that something approaching the 62 billion of American aid that was shipped by Biden last year, something of that order, 60 to 80 billions worth of aid, military aid, flows in through the rest of this year. What I think the Ukrainians might want to do is reorganize some of their forces instead of having to throw everything onto the front line and just hold on, to reorganize themselves for some better sort of strategic push at some point in the spring of next year. If I was them, I'd be looking at how I might be able to do that, because at the moment they're having to throw everything onto the front lines because that's what the Russians are doing. But if they had a bit of a breather, certainly in terms of weapons supplies, they might be able to reorganize some of their better force and elite forces into some more offensive, couple of corps of really offensive troops, to give themselves some options for next year, assuming they can get through to the winter, and then get through the winter without losing too much more territory.
And John, just a final thought from you. You've got the military experience behind your diplomatic know-how. So how does Ukraine make the best of the situation as it stands today?
I don't think an offensive by Ukraine's on the cards at all, to be honest. I think Ukraine's been on defensive since 2023 when their offensive failed. And haven't shown they've had the capacity or the men or the organisation to go back on the offensive. And I think the Kursk business was a sideshow, I think we spoke about before. I think what worries me most, if I might say, is about the mood and morale in Ukraine. The country is very tired, and there's a very interesting article in The Spectator today by Owen Matthews talking about politics, should we say, continuation of politics inside Ukraine and people challenging Zelensky's authority. There's questions over Ukrainian mobilization. There's questions over their military organization, their logistics, their arms supplies, and the efficacy of their defences. So I'm concerned actually that focus about, should we say, the hyper-tactical battle, but actually strategically people are tired, and I think they may not see the light at the end of the tunnel.
So how does Ukraine make the best of the situation it finds itself in?
I think it's a hang on. I think hanging on, hoping that Russia's economy does come under pressure, hoping that the arms help them defend better, hoping that the Russian economy implodes under its own problems, as spelt out in St. Petersburg the last few weeks ago. I think that's what Ukraine's hope is, but unfortunately they are a disadvantage of men, material and arms. They've been at that situation for 3.5 years, and the recovery for all those things doesn't seem to be coming over the horizon for them.
John Foreman, good to have you on Sitrep. Thank you very much. Well, several thousand of the troops fighting against Russia are not Ukrainian, but people from other countries who have volunteered to join the battle for Ukraine's survival. Some were already combat veterans. Others had no military experience whatsoever. The journalist Colin Freeman, who's joined us many times on Sitrep from Ukraine, has got to know quite a number of those serving in Ukraine's Foreign Legion. And now he's documented the experiences of 12 international volunteers, half of them British veterans, in a new book, and it's titled The Mad and the Brave.
Well, I think if you ask them, none of them will say they're mad. They'll all just say, no, that's not me. But I think it's a good title because it describes, most of them are, I think, are a bit of, if you get them in a quiet moment, they'll admit they're a bit of a mix of both, really. You do have to have quite a lot of guts, I think, to go out there and go on those Ukrainian front lines, because this is the Russian military. It's a peer army, and the Ukrainians are the underdogs. On the other hand, I would say 9/10 of the people I've spoken to, when they told family, friends, work colleagues, and pretty much anybody else about their plans to go to Ukraine, the overwhelming response they got back was, "You are mad. Are you crazy? Have you lost your marbles?"
Did you get a sense of what motivated them to join, Colin?
Yes, I mean, in some cases it's because they missed out on Iraq and Afghanistan, or as many of your viewers and listeners will know, you go to Afghanistan and then you don't really get out beyond the wire. So quite a lot of people who want to see action properly, who for one reason or another didn't get to do so at the time. Then there's a few who did actually fight in Afghanistan. They miss the army life, really. These are usually people who've left the military since then, and they want a chance to rekindle that camaraderie, that those old friendships, the old way of life. And I mean, for some of them also, they're quite candid and say, like, they don't enjoy civilian life that much anyway. So in a sense, there's not a huge amount for them. They're not distraught at leaving the UK behind. And they often find Ukraine quite a welcoming place, quite apart from the fact that they're going there to help the country defend itself. They find that the culture there is very sort of amenable to their outlook. They like the fact that it's a country that celebrates old school warrior values, where the kind of outlook on life that they have is shared by a lot of the people and indeed celebrated.
And Colin, as people, how different or not are the veterans compared to those who have no military experience?
Well, yeah, in the book, there are a few people who've gone out there with literally no military experience at all, who are just people who decided, like, they're not happy with life in the UK. Often people who wanted to join the military when they were young and then got turned down either for medical reasons or for something else. I must say, the idea for anybody of going out there and fighting without previous military experience seems absolutely remarkable to me. I'm amazed many of them even considered it, let alone going out there and sticking with it, which some of them did. And certainly a lot of the ex-regular soldiers who are out there, some of them just think, like, there's no way you could possibly survive in that environment without prior military training. But quite a few of them have. And in terms of how they've coped, I mean, a lot of them just, they mug up on, they research online how you fight. They look at YouTube videos. They ask around. They ask people who are, more experienced, and they basically just learn on the job, which sounds crazy. But on the other hand, you have to remember a lot of Ukrainian soldiers are in that position as well. A lot of the Ukrainians are ordinary men and women who, prior to the war, were just doing normal civilian jobs, then find themselves chucked in at the deep end. So it's not that unusual within the context of the Ukrainian war. One or two of the volunteers have also said to me that not having spent time in the British Army was actually in some ways quite useful, because they didn't have any preset expectations. And I think some of the British and American soldiers who turned up to the Legion at the start and then went home, quite often it was because they were comparing what they were having to do in Ukraine with what they had in, say, Afghanistan or Iraq, where you've got an entire military structure behind you that you're very familiar with. You've got air superiority, you've got Kazivat, you've got all these things. Ukraine suddenly seems a lot tougher by comparison, whereas for the people who are complete amateurs, who've never fought before, they know no different.
Can you just tell us a bit more about some of the experiences of those veterans that they had and what they told you about them?
Well, one, for example, who had never fought before, I remember him telling me how the first time he's in a trench, he's not actually sure which way he's supposed to be pointing his weapon because no one's told them. And he nearly machine guns 5 fellow members of his Ukrainian forces who wander into the no man's land ahead of him. This is just, the kind of random bad organisation on the front line. Others, the ex-regular soldiers who are out there. There's one, Andrew Hill, who goes out there and is captured by the Russians during a gunfight down in the south near Mykolaiv, one of the southern port cities of Ukraine. He's doing an operation between, sort of very near the enemy lines, taking a look, trying to get some eyes on some Russians, and then they get spotted. There's a gunfight. His friend, his colleague is killed. He then spends 4 months in captivity. During that time, he's tortured, electrocuted, so on, and is eventually returned to the UK 4 months later as part of a big prisoner swap that also involves about a dozen other foreigners. So that you've got stories like that. You've got also stories of people having to rescue people from minefields, people getting involved in all sorts of gunfights, lots of artillery duels, which is very unfamiliar territory for a lot of British soldiers, and all kinds of things where often they're worried that they're being used as cannon fodder because they're in an unfamiliar combat environment. They don't always really know what's going on, which is another part of the challenge.
And having talked to these people and written about them, has it changed your opinion at all about the Legionnaires? There's quite a few of them who went out there who I thought would do it for a few months, get the kind of the box ticked, the itch scratched, and then they would go home. And I've been surprised by how many have continued to go out there to fight. Occasionally they come home on leave for a while back to the UK or the US, but and you think, right, that's it, we won't see them out there again. Next thing you hear, they're back out there for another few months, and some of them have been out there more or less non-stop for 3 years. That surprises me, but it seems for them, a lot of them, it's combat becomes a bit of an addictive thing. They miss the buzz, and also they have their comrades out there who are also fighting and in some cases dying, and when they're not there they feel like they're letting their comrades down, and for those comrades who are not there anymore, they feel like, look, we owe it to so-and-so to carry on fighting and winning the war. So that's something I never really expected, the level of commitment that a lot of people have shown to it once they've initially gone in. And the book, The Mad and the Brave, The Untold Story of Ukraine's Foreign Legion, has just been published. Colin Freeman, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And what's interesting talking to Colin and reading the book is you get a sense of Ukraine's army having to work around some significant disorganisation. Is that just a fact of war, Mike, or is it something that could be worked on to improve their chances?
It's both. I mean, it's certainly a fact of war that foreign fighters tend to go into a situation of disorganization because they come from different military cultures or no military culture, and they're having to fit into something else. So all of them bring different expectations, different levels of expertise. And if they're formed into, in the case of the International Legion, where they're then put into small units that can work together, so you get two Brits and a Canadian, say, who've got enough common experiences to work together, but others that won't have. So foreign fighters are welcome, but for the commanders, it is a mixed blessing. They're glad that they're there, but they also create issues and problems of their own. But it is also true, I think, as Colin was implying there, that the Brits that we know of that have gone, and the ones that I speak to now and have spoken to on a regular basis, they were quite critical about the lack of organisation within the Ukrainian army. One of the things he said there is that we never knew what was going on. And I was talking to lads who were in Bakhmut when they were still fighting over Bakhmut, and they were saying to me, "What's happening?" And I said, "Well, don't you know?" And they said, "No, we've no idea. We've no idea what happens outside of our 1 kilometre." And so I was filling them in on what, the way the war seemed to be going from their point of view as part of my, commitment to them. So disorganization is all part of it, but the Ukrainian army it's in transition between an old Soviet army and a more Western style army. And that transition, you can see it, more at the top than at the bottom. And it will take some time if the Ukrainians keep going in that direction.
And Ukraine claimed early on that it had 20,000 volunteers for its Foreign Legion in the earliest days. They don't give numbers now. Some reporting says it's actually more like 1,500 to 2,000. Regardless, it's clear from Colin that there are some people absolutely committed to it.
Yes, and there always are. And again, I mean, he mentioned a couple of things. One is camaraderie. A lot of people go for the sense of camaraderie. And also, what I've characterised before as the freedom of the conflict zone. It is addictive. The freedom that a fighter has, a soldier has, any member of the armed forces has in the conflict zone, even though they've got their own codes of discipline and their own issues and the things that they've got to do right. in a conflict zone, no other rules apply. Only your military rules apply. Only your own combat procedures apply. No other rules apply because there's no law and order. That's all broken down. There is a freedom of the conflict zone. If you want a vehicle, take a vehicle and use it and bring it back in one piece. If you want to go and do something, check it out with the officer, then go and do it. That freedom, which is so different to civilian life, I've seen it myself. It becomes very addictive in certain people. And what happens, I think, with the foreign fighters is that they're subject to the same sort of psychological rhythm as people in a country, as the formal army and soldiers. When the situation is absolutely desperate, when it looks as if a country is about to be invaded and overwhelmed, there is a rush to the colours. When the situation is desperate, nothing remains but to fight. People go with quite high morale because there's no alternative. And equally, when a country looks as if it's winning, when things are going well, there's a push to the colours because you want to be part of it. But the bit in the middle, when it's just carrying on and it doesn't seem to be leading somewhere, just as morale in any armed forces will lessen, will be sapped by that, so the foreign fighters don't really feel the same push to go to an endless open-ended war. They'll be there at the beginning when it's desperate, they'll be there at the end when it's victorious, but nobody is so keen to go in the middle period unless they're a bit addicted to the freedom of the conflict zone.
Those are really interesting thoughts. And Colin and I talked about much more, including how the Ukrainian Foreign Legion is or isn't organised, and the difference between the front line and the zero line of combat in Ukraine. You can hear the whole thing in an extra edition of the Sitrep podcast, which is online now. Well, the Ukraine war has shown the power of emerging technology to change where, how, and with what war is fought. Not my words, but those of the recent Strategic Defence Review, which is built firmly around trying to stay ahead of potential enemies in many military technology races. And so over the next few weeks, we plan to dig into technologies that are in their infancy or even still on the drawing board that have the potential to transform military operations. Things like quantum computing, which could be millions or billions of times faster than our current devices. Sounds great, but it could also wipe out current digital security systems. Could biotechnology make ground troops stronger and safer? Could robots just replace those troops? We start, though, with drones. No, they're not new, but scientists believe they do have much more potential still to be unlocked, specifically by getting them to work together in swarms. Think about it this way. One bee sting wouldn't be deadly to most people, but an entire swarm could be lethal. We've seen the early stages of this technology in very innocent but spectacular 3D light shows. So how do we go from that to a cutting-edge military capability? Technology journalist and author of the book Swarm Troopers, David Hambling, explains.
The light show drones aren't true swarms. Just as at the moment in Ukraine, what you're mainly seeing is a lot of drones, but it's not actually a swarm. Because a swarm is a group that is acting as a single unit with a set of coordinating rules. So in the case of the light shows, what you've got there is basically a lot of very smart choreography and air traffic control. All the drones in that are programmed in advance for where to go at what moment, and then they are tracked, and then there is also a central computer which watches where they're going, and if anything is going out of line, tells it where it ought to be. So those aren't true swarms. For a true swarm, what you need to see is something like a flock of birds or a school of fish or a swarm of insects. And particularly you get these spectacular murmurations of starlings. And for years and years, biologists couldn't figure out how you could get 10,000 birds flying together in perfect unison, perfect coordination, without any of them crashing into each other. And they realized that the birds are actually doing it by having each member of the flock is following a simple set of rules in terms of maintaining spacing and alignment and staying with the rest of the group. And by following a few simple rules, you can get a large number of individual flying units, whether they're birds or insects or drones, working together in a single collaborative group.
So how could drone swarms actually transform military operations?
Well, at the moment, even though we're seeing large numbers of small drones in action, each one of those still needs to have a human operator. So in Ukraine, you've got thousands and thousands of drone operators. And not only is the limitation of one operator per drone a problem, there's also the problem with bandwidth. There's only so much radio space, so you can only have so many drones flying in an area at once. Now, if instead of having to control each drone individually, an operator controls a swarm, then it gets rid of those limitations and you can have one operator controlling 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 drones, which are all operating in the same area at the same time. And that suddenly gives you a massively magnified capability.
So how would that scenario that you've just described transform military operations and the battlefield, the airspace?
So that would mean rather than simply having 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 drones attacking at once, you could have 100 all coming down simultaneously in one coordinated action, so that you have scout drones which identify where targets are and attack drones which engage them instantly. So you will get sudden, dramatic precision attacks across wide areas, and that is likely to be transformative.
So is this about creating an overwhelming weapon that can't be beaten?
No single weapon is going to be a silver bullet, but certainly, as we've seen in Ukraine, the drones are seriously problematic in that no one has figured out a very good way to counter them yet, and turning them into swarms is going to certainly multiply their capability manyfold. And there are all sorts of use cases because unlike most types of weapon, this is kind of universal and can be applied on land, in the air, at sea, underwater. It has all sorts of applications. It's going to be transformative in lots of fields of warfare.
Yes, all kinds of applications, David. How much of this is about attack capability or how much of it is about intelligence gathering?
As usual, it can do everything. Certainly, it's very applicable to intelligence gathering because drones are now universally used for intelligence. In Ukraine, for example, you have, for the first time in history, no fog of war. You have a transparent front line with drones covering every square metre of the front down to a depth of 10 to 20 kilometres. Whenever anything moves, it gets attacked. And it gets attacked by drones because they are cheap and numerous. It means you can have them covering everywhere all the time. Low-cost systems using commercial electronics are becoming vastly more powerful.
So have we seen drone swarms deployed militarily yet?
They have been deployed. We haven't really seen them very much in action. We know that the Israelis used swarming drones in Gaza in 2021 to counter Hamas rockets, and that's the first known use of this type of system. For there, it was a pure intelligence reconnaissance operation. The problem with Hamas firing these small rockets is that they tend to just have 2 guys who set up a rocket, fire it, and then get out of the area before anyone can catch them. By having a drone swarm, the Israelis were able to keep a wide area under surveillance and get instant real-time updates as to what was happening, and that allowed them to track and engage people firing rockets before they could get away. So certainly swarms are out there. The Israelis are keeping it very close to their chest exactly what their capability is, but we do know it's there. And in Ukraine, we are now seeing the first emergent signs that there are some drone swarms being used, though, again, there's little information on those.
So how big were those Israeli drone swarms?
You mean in terms of the physical drones were probably small quadcopters? We don't know the exact number working together, but it was probably in the range of 10 to 20. That seems to be the sort of range that they're working with now. They're not scaling up much beyond that. And I've actually talked to people who've used smaller drone swarms in Gaza more recently, where you just have one operator with 5 drones, and they are able to switch between them, and the drones that they're not using can stay in a holding pattern and, for example, hover outside a door and let the operator know if that door opens. So we're already seeing quite a lot of small-scale use, but nothing large-scale yet.
So for the layperson, how does swarming actually work at the moment? Are all the drones operating autonomously and talking to each other? Is there one master drone controlling all the others, or does it have to be done under remote control by a human?
So military tend to talk about collaborative, cooperative autonomy rather than swarming. So what that means is you've got a number of drones that are autonomous, so all of the drones are flying themselves, but they're also communicating with each other and collaborating to achieve an end together. So there is no single leader. You can take out any number of individual drones and the swarm will still continue to function. But it is a collective entity.
And what is the human controlling exactly then?
So the human is the supervisor. The human is able to say to the swarm, go over there and look for this and tell me what you find. The human operator also, certainly as far as the near future goes, will have the final say on whether the drones can attack a specific target. So it may be as straightforward as the swarm covers an area, and as it finds targets, it sends images to the operator saying, I think this is a Russian tank, should I attack it? And the operator then says either yes or go and get a closer look, or no, that's not a target. So the human operator, rather than actually flying the drones, is now simply the commander, the overseer.
So who is the most advanced in the development of military drone swarming technology?
Now, there is an interesting question. The Israelis certainly, who are very advanced in most forms of drone warfare, have certainly put a lot of work into this, and I suspect they're quite well ahead. The Americans have thrown quite a lot of money into it. We haven't seen any particularly notable results yet, but I imagine there is a certain amount going on there. The UK even has a swarm squadron, but again, progress there seems to be slow. We've seen work in India, and they've demonstrated military swarming drones. We've seen work in Turkey. We've seen a lot of work in China, but again, we don't know what the actual outcome of that will be. Russia has made some claims, but we haven't seen much impressive from them yet. And Ukraine, we are expecting to see some serious swarming from them sometime in the next 6 months or so. So I'd say that there are a lot of horses in this race, and no one is crossing the finish line for large-scale swarming attacks quite yet.
And what about vulnerabilities? What about the development of technology to defeat drone swarms?
This is a difficult one. The best way to stop a drone at the moment is by jamming, because if you can break the radio link between the operator and the drone, it becomes useless. The problem with swarming drones is that they don't need that radio link. They can operate more or less on their own. So when you can't stop that, difficult. There was one interesting project in America called Super Swarm, looking at counter-swarm tactics, and they were wondering if they could find a way to outwit a swarm. So, for example, if you can lure the swarm into attacking a dummy target, you get not just one drone, but every drone in the swarm, because they all fall for the same trick. So if you can do something like that, you might be able to outmaneuver it. But at the moment, the best counter to a swarm looks like it's likely to be another swarm of interceptor drones.
So when do you think we will actually see drone swarms routinely used in conflict?
We're seeing small-scale drone swarming used at the moment already in Ukraine. Over the next 6 months, I think we're likely to see significantly larger swarms, and over the next 2 to 3 years, I think attacks by swarms of drones and the use of swarming drones to gather intelligence is going to become routine and is going to get steadily more capable from there. Certain amount of this will depend also on artificial intelligence technology and how it builds on that. So expect to see quite a lot of advances pretty soon.
David Hambling, really good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mike, I was looking at some of the projects different countries are working on, and China's unveiled plans for a mothership, a plane which could launch 100 suicide drones at a time. And it's not just new hardware. There was recently a demo of software that can get drones already in service with US armed forces working collaboratively. Depending on your point of view, it could be exciting or absolutely terrifying.
Yes, it could. I mean, the challenge, in a way, it's both exciting and terrifying. And modern militaries, and say us in Britain, there's no choice but to keep on working on this, because even though some of the technologies raise big ethical questions about autonomous systems, or say about gene editing, which is raises big ethical questions, and we can consider those ethical questions, but you can't stop researching, even though you're considering the ethical questions, because our adversaries are working on these things all the time. time. If we take 20 years to halt some of our research on this, as has been suggested, we'll just be 20 years behind our adversaries, who are certainly not going to halt if they think there's something to be gained. And the point is that, there are some technologies that they're way ahead. I mean, robotics is one of them, but we sort of understand the possibilities of robotics. We understand the possibilities of computing and of the use of space and so on. But we don't really understand the possibilities of quantum computing and quantum mechanics, or of biotechnologies and gene editing, or nanotechnologies, the ability to create very, very tiny machines, or AI. I mean, artificial intelligence, what effect that will have. All we know is that some elements of these technologies could be capable of being weaponized, but we don't know which will be weaponized, and we don't really know who will weaponize them. Chances are it won't be us, but we do need to understand these things so that we can anticipate what the challenge might then be. That's the problem that all of these technologies, as it were, pose for us. Some aspects will be weaponized, but we don't know by whom or quite when.
And just a final thought, Mike, as you alluded to, the worry for some is we become too reliant on technology. If someone else's science beats ours, we'll be left high and dry.
Yeah, and that's why you've got to keep on researching it. You may not like any of these technologies. I mean, we don't employ chemical weapons, but we research them, and chemical agents do exist in Britain, because unless you can produce them, you can't then produce the antidote. So it's the same argument. You've got to keep researching them, and that was very much a thought in the Strategic Defence Review recently, that all of these things are pretty unpredictable, but you have no choice but to stay up with them, at least even if you're not going to field them. You've got to anticipate what they might do.
Mike, thank you, and thanks to all of our guests this time. On Sitrep next week, we'll bring you a beginner's guide to quantum computing and explain why it's looking like a safe bet as a truly transformative technology for militaries. James Hurst will be here for that. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.